Next, we're going to talk about variables and how to use them inside of your Unity scripts. And the basic variable types that we want to start off with is an integer, a float, a boolean, and a string. Easiest way to think about it, integer is going to be any whole number, so not a fraction. That could be things like health, lives, anything that can be rounded to a whole number. Float is going to be the fractional values, so anything with a decimal point. Multipliers are common. Speed or anything that you need very precise control over, you might want to consider a float. A Boolean is either true or false. It can only be one or the other, and we would use this a lot inside of conditional statements, for example. And then finally, string is going to be the characters that you use. So think about anything on your keyboard could typically be represented as a string value. The easiest way to think about a variable is just an empty container. And remember that when you create your variable, your empty container, you have to give it a type. When we create our variable, the container is empty. Now, a weird thing is that with primitive types, they get a default value, so it's not technically empty. But you should start thinking about it that way, because if you don't give it a default, then at some point it's going to create a bug because you were assuming the wrong thing. The reason that variables are powerful is because even though we have this container, we can swap in data and manipulate it and then change that over time. And if at any point in time we want to know something about that data, we can ask for the variable by name. So in this case, we have created a variable named ammo of type int. And then if we want to put data into it, we want to assign it, and that's going to be our equals, the value 5. And because 5 is an integer, right, it's a whole number, it can go into this container. So in terms of syntax, it would be written like this. It would be type name, and that's declaring our variable. And then if we want to change the value assigned in our variable, we would equals, so we would assign it to be 5, and then some data type that can go inside of it. And here are just a few examples of something that you might see in script. One thing you may notice is that I'm adding an underscore before my variables appear. The reason I'm doing this is just anytime I have variables that are directly inside of my class, so in this case my player, my class-wide variables, I like to put an underscore in front of those just to make them easier to find. That is not a requirement, and many people do that and many people don't. We mentioned that we can retrieve the variable by name to access the data that's inside. In this case, we have a debug.log just so we're printing it to our console. And if we want to know the ammo count, then we just need to reference the variable named ammo. Then that will get printed along with our debug.log statement. Same thing with the multiplier or a Boolean or a name or whatever. Just remember that you can access the data and it will return whatever data is inside of. Name is alive, damage multiplier, and so forth. And we can change the data by assigning it whenever we want, and then just access the current data at any point in time. It's also important to reiterate that you can only put data that matches the type of the variable. So in this example, if we have a variable of type score multiplier, we can put this value in there because it is a type of float. And we mark a float value with an F if we have anything after the decimal. So that's a float value. But what this also means is that we cannot necessarily put in a Boolean inside of a float variable. There are some ways in which you can convert data types, but don't rely on those for now. They're not going to help you learn this stuff more easily. It's just going to make things more confusing. So just remember, try and keep your data types the same as the variable. Otherwise, it probably should not go in there. And this is the syntax for what that would look like. And remember, you cannot do something like this. So let's look at a quick example inside of Unity. If you've been following along with the series so far, you may have this level controller object in a script. If not, just create that really quickly. And inside of level controller, if you double click, I have emptied out everything inside of here. So we're starting pretty fresh. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new game object by right clicking, create empty, and I'm going to name that player. In this case, let's imagine that we have a player and imagine that they have some health. So I'm going to create a health script. And once that compiles, I'm going to give my player the health behavior. I'm also going to reset the transforms here just in case. It's not really going to matter, but I think it's good practice to start doing now. Just going to save it again just in case. I'm going to go inside of my health script. Inside of my health script, I'm going to clear everything out, and I'm going to start adding a few variables. At this point, you should consider what are some variable types that might be related to health that I could want inside of my game. One thing that I think that I may want is a current health. So that would be int current health. I like this underscore convention. Again, not everyone uses it, but I like to use it to mark, we call them member variables or class-wide variables, or fields would all be names for the same thing. But these are variables that can be accessed anywhere inside of your class. So they're important to recognize, which is why I add the underscore here. So again, that's my convention. And let's say that I want to give my current health a default. We could assign that to 5. Let's consider what else I might want to have as my health behavior. Maybe a max health. So I'll add a max health here as well. Let's give that a default. And let's make that different than our current health. And finally, let's add another type. Maybe a Boolean is alive. And we'll say the player is alive by default. Again, I always like to establish defaults here when I can, just to make it really clear what my variables are assigned to. If I left this blank, ints will automatically default to 0 being the default, and Booleans, I believe, will default to false. But for readability, let's give them the default. And also, I'm going to show that we can get these inside of our code. So I'm gonna use awake for this. And inside of awake, let's just say what the starting health is. So debug.log starting health. So this is the string that's going to print to my console. Remember, we learned about string variables. And I'm going to append, that's this plus right here, going to append a current health. You may be thinking that this should not work because this is a string and this is an int. And we were learning that you should not combine those inside of the same variable. In this case, it's actually doing a conversion automatically inside of debug.log. But if you wanted to be explicit about it, you could type toString. This would be one of many types of conversions you could do. And in our case, we could convert an integer into a string to match so that it matches along here if we want. Now, just to show you, if we didn't do that, and let's say we print the max health, it would still work. And this is because debug.log is automatically converting that. But I just want to make this clear to you. If I save and I play it, check our console, let's see how it prints both, even though this is an integer and this integer, and one we're converting and one we're not. Again, that's just a thing with debug.log. I'm just going to keep things simple and do it that way. And let's try to reassign this. So let's say we print the starting health, and then we assign the current health to be equal to the max health. So in this case, we're not even using a value here. We're just saying access whatever is stored inside of current health, reassign that variable to be equal to whatever is inside of max health. So in this case, this should say current health. So this container, we're going to assign the value 10 into it. And maybe that's a little bit hard to read at first, but programming is like a language. The more you speak it and the more you are fluent in it, the easier it is for you to interpret it and understand when you see it. And lastly, I'm going to say health after set to max. Let's actually print the current health again. So we're going to print it up here. We're going to reassign it and print it again down here. And then we can see how it changes over time. Save it. Hit play, compile, and you'll see, so starting health is 5, then health after set to max. Again, these are both accessing the current health variable. So you can see it's printing, right? If you highlight that, it's printing 5 here and 10 here. So we have successfully reassigned it. Now let's talk about a slightly more complex topic, and this is the difference between a value type of variable and a reference type of variable. Any variables that you use in C# will typically be one or the other, and a value type you can think of as the primitive types that we've been using so far, so int, boolean, string, and float. You could actually create your own value type variables, and there's more inside of Unity already, but you could create a custom one, and we would refer to that as a struct. So instead of creating a new class of child, we could create a struct child. But by default, if we create a new script, it creates a class, and a class is going to be a reference type. Even if this seems confusing, the easiest way to think about it is this. If you're working with value types, so our primitive types, or if we make custom new ones, anytime we create a container, it is self-contained, meaning that if we were to try and reassign child01 equals child02, it's going to copy the value, and we're just going to take that value and store it inside of child1. Inside of Unity, we're going to be working with a lot of reference types, so those are just going to be classes. And what I mean by this is if we create a variable of child1 and we give it data, it's not actually making a copy of the data and putting it in there like we are with our value types, like when we reassigned our health value. It is actually just pointing to the data that exists somewhere else. And then again, if we create a second variable called child02 and we give it this child over here, these are both pointing towards the same child. Now, the reason that this is important is because if I ever say child1 increase age, and then I try to look at what the age is in child2, it's going to be the original because I'm only changing the age of this child, not of this one. However, in a reference type variable, if I were pointing towards this child and I said child01 dot change age, if I were to access child2 and ask for the age, it would appear different. It would, because these are both accessing the same data. So again, a slightly more complex topic, but I wanted to introduce the concept to you pretty early on. It will be almost impossible to solve certain types of bugs if you don't understand this concept. Another easy way to think about that is if you were to do something called serialize field with a bracket, serialize field in front of your variable. This is telling your script to expose this to the inspector. So if we take any of our primitive variable types and we expose it in the inspector for a value type of variable, it's going to appear like this, where we can input a value inside of the inspector and we can change that. So we could change the starting health from 5 to 10 or whatever. We could change the name, booleans or checkboxes and so forth. It will have an input field for you. Now with a reference type, so classes, and if you create a new script, that will be a reference type and a new class or a new component or behavior or whatever. Reference types, when you expose them into the inspector, are looking for a reference of something inside of your level. So it's going to look like an empty box and it'll be looking for a type of class. So this will appear empty and we would have to find that. We'd have to drag and drop that in. So if you're not sure what's what, just remember classes are reference types, and most of your basic data types are going to be value types. And up to now, we've been working with these, but as we start moving into more complex concepts, we're going to start working with our reference types, and we'll need to drag and drop those in. First, let's look at how to expose a few variables to the inspector. Now, if I look at my inspector at first, I'm not going to see anything, right? Everything is contained inside of health. And that's because everything right now inside of there is private. And we'll talk about access modifiers later on and the concept of encapsulation. But if I open up health, let's say we want to expose our max health to the inspector. And this might be something a designer would want to change. So I'm going to do bracket, serialize field, int max health. And if I save and let that compile, come back in here, you can see that now we can give a new value here. We could put the default value into the variable. Now what's important to understand is if I change this, let's say if I change 8 you'll recognize I was in play mode, which is bad because if I do that, remember what we talked about values reverting if we manipulate them in play mode. So watch out for that. Outside of play mode, I'm going to change this max health value to 8, save, and I want you to watch what happens. If we look at our script, you'll see we're setting our default of current health to 5, and then this one that we expose in the inspector, we're setting the default to 10 here, but we've just now changed it to 8 over here. So the question is, what is the max health? If we hit play, our max health is 8. Get out of play mode. It's important to understand that your inspector value, like whatever the value the designer puts in there, this is going to supersede whatever default value you put in here. So if I were to change this to 15, save, come back in here, hit play, you'll see our max health is still 8. You'll find yourself just really frustrated by constantly trying to change a value and not understanding why it won't work. Where what we're doing here is we're just changing the default value, like the initial value whenever we first expose it in the inspector. But what we really wanted to do was change the value over here. So watch out for that if you're using the inspector to manipulate variables. The next thing to be aware of is if I were to type in public, and you will see a lot of other tutorials do this, technically this will expose your variable to the inspector, but it will also expose it to other classes. Now in this case, I want to do exactly what my intent is. My intent is to keep the variable private. I don't want other classes to see it, but I do want to manipulate it in the inspector. If you only want to manipulate it in the inspector, don't use the keyword public because that will let other classes see it too. Just use serialized field. But let's say in this example, we did want to have other classes be able to see whether or not this thing with health is alive. And another thing is, in terms of naming convention, proper naming convention is to capitalize if you're using a public variable. So I am going to try and be good about that. One little trick you can use if you want to rename a variable and you're not sure if you've used this anywhere, if you're inside of Visual Studio and you double click and you right click and you go to rename, I can type in a new name, I can press enter, and anywhere that that variable was, it will change. So just to show you, if I were to rename max health, for example, I right click, rename, and let's do with no underscore, like that. See how it changed it down here too? It'll also change it if it's in other scripts as well. It's just super handy to know about, so I'm going to rename that again to change it back. All right, so now that we have made this Boolean public, I want to show you something. If we go to our level controller, and just to remind you, this is just an empty game object in our scene with an empty script that I created named level controller, right? It's empty. And we drag the script onto it, make sure that it's active. So inside of here, if I do serialized field, and I look for a type of health, and I just call it the same thing just to be clear, you might be thinking right now, like, what is this going to look like in the inspector? Remember how we exposed this other variable over here? This is a value type of variable. The health is a class, which is a reference type, meaning that if we're inside of level controller and we expose this in the inspector and I save, you'll see my level controller is looking for a type of health. This is not an input thing that I can put in there. What I have to do at this point is I have to reference a instance of the class health in my scene. And all that means is that anything in my scene that has the health component attached to it can be referenced here. So in this case, this is looking for anything with the component health. If I try to drag in directional light, it won't let me because that does not have the component health. But if I try to drag in my player, which does have the health component, right there, it will accept it. And what that allows me to do now is I can say void awake inside of my level controller. And I'm going to say debug.log is player alive space. I'm going to append to that health dot, and I'm going to click over here. Because we made this public, we can actually access this. We can't access anything else on the health script. But because this is public, we can access is alive. So health.isAlive. And remember that debug.log will do a string conversion for us. So, we could convert it automatically, but in this case, we don't need it. And so isPlayerAlive, this is going to look at whatever health class instance is referenced out of our inspector, right here. It's going to be the player's health. We're dragging here, and we're going to receive that and print whether that particular health instance is alive. Let's click back. We should see it print as true. Hit play, console. Is player alive? True. Awesome. So hopefully that gets you thinking about value type versus reference type. Again, it's a more complex concept, but it's important to understand why some values will have input fields like this or checkboxes, and some values will require you to find that type of instance inside of your scene. And that's the reason why.